Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'd like to welcome you to the 41st Annual Sherman Hoslett Memorial Lecture. And most of you know me, I'm Wendy Stevens. And I'm delighted this morning to present. And actually, I'm going to turn this back on while we just get going here. Hold it to the front. There we go. I want to introduce my cast. I'm delighted to present the 100 Years of Biology at Luther College. Before I start, it's been tradition in the past, and I would like to continue it, to ask all of the past Hoslett speakers who are here to stand up. So would you please stand up if you've been a Hoslett speaker in the past? So some of these folks have been our Luther alumni. Some are biology emeriti professors. And actually, I'm both. I'm going to be both. I graduated from Luther in 1969, and this spring I'm retiring after 42 years. I think, after doing the history, that I know that I'm the longest teaching professor. When I started to think about my topic, the question was, what should I talk about? And I thought, well, why not the biology department and its history? Because this is our centennial year. Biology has been taught at Luther for 100 years. And so what I did was I started doing a little research. I read a lot of the college histories. I looked at catalogs back to 1911. They're very interesting. I looked at yearbooks. I looked at, I did a lot of interviewing of people, and I read a lot of CHIPS articles. You can get them online. And so what I did was I basically tried to compile sort of an anecdotal history of Luther, biology specifically. And I'm going to, of course, not touch everything. I can't do that in an hour, but I hope that I have chosen things that you will be interested in hearing about. The images that I'm going to show you on the screen are all authentic, and by that I mean they've either been taken from the archives at Luther, they've been taken from CHIPS, they've been taken from the yearbook, they've been taken from personal photo collections, or Robert Fitton took a lot of photographs this last week of things in the department that I wanted pictures of. I also have several students up here who have volunteered to do student parts. When reading CHIPS, there were a lot of really interesting anecdotal stories that were told from the student perspective, so I asked them to actually be students of particular eras. And I've simply rewritten CHIPS articles so that they will be spoken in first person instead of as they were written originally in CHIPS. And so I've got Sam DePachter, and I have Amanda Schaefer. Amanda's going to play another male. I have a little trouble recruiting males. I've got Brenna Gibbons, I've got Blake Funky, and I have Margaret Yap. And so I'm just delighted. And so they're dressed in their 1940s period costumes. And with that, I think we're going to begin. I found that determining the actual beginning of biology at Luther was not as easy as I originally thought it would be. In 1877, Andrew Veblen came to Luther, but he came to teach Latin, penmanship, and English. 2 years later, he introduced physiology to the curriculum. And right after that, he convinced the faculty, all 8 of them that time, that's the entire faculty of Luther, that they should purchase a microscope. And so this was the first piece of biological equipment that was purchased for Luther College. Veblen left in 1880. Physiology left also. Zoology was taught by a smattering of professors, but it too disappeared, and it disappeared in 1890. Just a second here. In 1911, CHIPS talks about the fact that a well-planned and thorough introduction to biology will be of interest and advantage to all students, giving a clear insight into the significance of the developments of this science. CHIPS also mentions that a biology course would be an aid in driving out quackery and humbug. A tribute to misinformation given by the newspapers at that time. So in fall of 1912, this gentleman, Hans Hillebo, was hired, and he was hired to teach biology, 8 credits of biology in addition to education courses. At that time, biology was part of the preparatory school. Luther had 3 years of high school curriculum for students who arrived without sufficient academic background. And so that's where biology started. But this was the first time the college actually hired somebody to teach biology, and biology from this point on remains in the curriculum until today. And so that's where I'm basing the beginning of biology at Luther College in 1912. The first biology laboratory budget was $2. We won't make any comments about today. It increased to $505 the second year to purchase needed equipment and supplies. For perspective, out of the catalog, you can see that, I've got a pointer here, that if you were going to the preparatory department at that time, you paid $62.50 for the entire year. If you were actually a college student, you only paid $42.50 for the entire year. Board was separate. Board was run by the boarding club, by students, but the catalog says for good, wholesome food, you could get a week's worth of food at the boarding club for about $2.53. In 1916, biology was offered on par with all the other science courses at the college, and that would have been chemistry and physics. And students now paid a lab fee of $5 a semester. And so what did lab work consist of back in 1916? Well, they did a lot of drawing of the museum collection. So these are some of the birds, stuffed birds from the museum collection. They did a lot of that. They dissected angleworms, and that's what they called them back then, and drew plates of the various organs. They studied the angleworms as far as their living habits and their environment, and they also drew and dissected ferns. Yes, Luther did have a museum. In 1877, President Larson received a collection of 600 bird eggs, and here they are on the screen, and that was the nucleus, the start of the museum. More collections arrived. By 1890, the college designated $50 to build shelving for the museum. And by 1912, the museum moved into this building. This is the chicken coop. The chicken coop was originally a barn, and then it was renovated for student housing. It stood just northwest of Old Green. And after student housing in 1912, the museum took over, and it was totally renovated in 1922. Also in 1922, the biology course offerings had increased. Now there were 4 courses. There was elementary zoology, in which they studied frogs; embryology, they studied chick and pig embryos; invertebrate zoology, those angleworms; and vertebrate zoology. In 1927, a new professor came. This is William Strunk. He was a powerhouse. The first thing he did was to totally renovate the lab, which was in the basement of Old Main. And this is what he did. He had more lighting put in. You can see we've got some, let's see if this is going to work for me. Come on. It just disappears up here. Light bulbs. Okay, we have light bulbs. That's good. We have one side of the room designated for lecture and recitation with a blackboard and a teacher's desk. We've got museum collection, not all of it, but some of it in cabinets so that can be used. And this, the catalog says, is the true laboratory. This is where they had microscopes, they had various preserved specimens, and the total value of what Luther owned as far as the biology department was concerned in equipment and specimens was valued at $4,200. Strunk also brought new courses into the curriculum. I was totally blown away when I found that in 1928-29, he started teaching organic evolution. This is from the catalog, a critical study of the theory of organic evolution. The purpose of the course is to give the student as thorough an understanding as possible in the course and cause of evolution, and to take up unbiasedly the arguments for and against the theory. 3 lectures per week, reports, readings, problems, and discussions, and this is one of his texts, The Origin of Species. This particular course persisted for 5 years, until 1933-34. At that time, it was replaced by genetics and eugenics. Eugenics was very popular at that time, and also a course called human heredity. During the spring and fall semesters of 1930, Strunk took basically a sort of year of leave, two half years, if you will, a year leave of absence to complete his PhD. And in his place, this individual came. This is Sherm Hazlitt, after whom this lecture series is named. Sherm had just graduated in the spring of 1930, and he was asked back as a teaching assistant, but in this case, he got to take thick over everything. For one semester, basically just that fall semester, I'm not totally sure who taught the spring semester in 1930. This is a student caricature out of Chips, 1930. And according to that particular article, Sherm was very well liked by students. He had a thriving guinea pig colony in the biology lab. And of course, these were all male students back there, and they really enjoyed watching the male guinea pigs defending their territory. In February of 1931, Strunk returned back to Luther, and he had his doctorate in hand.
To welcome Dr. Strunk back, we students had a festive board set up within the biology laboratory, prettily decorated with skeletons of a cat, a chicken, and so on. Brigham Young, our favorite guinea pig, was at the end of the table, and Professor Sherman Hoslett, as Toastmaster, sat at the other. It made a delightful scene. Included in the evening's festivities was awarding Brigham Young a diploma and the DAH, Doctor of Animal Husbandry.
When Hoslett left to pursue his master's degree, Strunk was then the only biology professor, but he added more courses, 14 total he was teaching, either annually or every other year. The biology lab in Maine was expanded to include a storage room and had a good collection of alcoholic and other illustrative material, and a considerable collection of charts and lantern slides. This is one of the illustrative pieces that was there in the 1930s. The copyright on this is 1935. This is the body scope. This scope has over here, when you pull it out of its wrapper, a disc, and you can turn that disc. And when you turn the disc, you will see different anatomical features, basically on the inside of these different individuals, the man and the female who are standing here. So if you continue to turn the scope, you continue to get different things. We get female external, and we get male external, but the problem with the male, as you might see, is that only the female internal generative organs were captured, and none of the male internal organs nor external were shown, so it remains a mystery. We've also got a picture from the lab when the lab was here in Valders. This is the only picture I have of the mannequin. And I'm sorry that when we moved, the mannequin disappeared in the move. This mannequin was purchased in 1932. Somebody put socks on it up here, that's the thing. But it was a plaster of Paris mache mannequin. The right side showed bones, the left side showed muscles. We had organs we could take out and a brain in 6 dissectable parts. Student research was prominent on campus in the 30s, just as it is today.
Next summer, Dr. Strunk and I plan to scour the territory of Winneshiek and Allamakee counties in search of all the different species of native plants, including lichens, mosses, ferns, and mushrooms, to be dried, mounted, and classified for an herbarium. I've already collected 1,000 different species and hope to approach 2,500 species by the end of the summer.
I started doing physiological experiments on white rats, counting their corpuscles and hanging weights on them to see how strong the muscles are. But I find that my real interest is in preparing slides of crow embryos. First, I collect the eggs and incubate them to the proper stage of development. Then, I section them with a microtome and mount them on slides.
Dr. Strunk decided that he would organize a biology club. And so in September of 1932, 40 male students gathered in the biology laboratory in Old Main to organize a club called the Linnaeus Society. The group was organized to meet once a month to hear lectures by outstanding men in the field of biology.
The first meeting of the Linnaeus Society was a rather colorful start. A local surgeon, Dr. Spavakin, spoke on life and customs of the Mexican people, illustrated by the physician himself dressed in native costume. He brought a pair of fleas, also dressed in native costume and preserved in a walnut shell, a sample of a highly intoxicating beverage made from the cactus plant, and 3,000 feet of film he had taken while in Mexico.
Other well-known speakers that actually came that year and the next year were Charlie Mayo from Mayo and Dr. Gunderson from La Crosse. The decade of the 1930s was, of course, during the Great Depression, and starting in the fall of 1932, biology majors who lacked sufficient funds to complete 4 years of training at Luther could take a practical coursework for 2 years, which prepared them either to enter medical school, go into conservation fields, or start research at universities. Also in 1932, women were allowed for the first time to take classes on Luther's campus.
We were not yet allowed to attend Luther College. Luther was still a school exclusively for men, but we were members of the first class of the Decorah Junior College for Girls. We had our own professors and our own classes, but we were allowed to register for biology at Luther and also to use Corn Library.
To assess how well his students were doing, Dr. Strunk required all biology majors, there were 10 of them at that time in 1933, to take the 2-hour medical aptitude test, which was very similar to today's MCAT. In the fall of 1933, Sherm Hazlitt returned with his master's degree. He taught the introductory and general coursework while Strunk, put a little later picture of Strunk on here. While Strunk was, like I mentioned before, a powerhouse, he taught all the other biology courses in addition to becoming the health director for the physical education department, and he taught 6 courses in that department. He set up the health service on campus, and he directed the activities of the college radio department. He did everything. He also gave lectures regionally. He did a lot of things. And then in the spring of 1939, Strunk just disappeared from Luther Records. He had been so popular, and all of a sudden, after some comment on lectures that he'd given in March of 1939, he disappeared from SHIMS. He disappeared from everything. And I couldn't help but imagine that maybe he was now at the University of Chicago Medical School because he had been the regional admissions officer for them. Maybe he was working in Des Moines because he was the one who wrote and administered the anatomy exam for all people needing licensure to become physicians in Iowa. But no, Strunk went to St. Olaf. I could hardly believe it. It was not, it was, well, anyway, it was sad. His legacy was huge. In 1939, out of 87 graduating students, 16 were biology majors. That is huge. This was a school that basically produced people to go on in ministry, people to go on in teaching, but not 16 out of 87 being biology majors. So it was a time of starting over. Sherm Hazlitt, by this time, had received his doctorate, and he came back in 1940 to become head of the department. On May 31st, 1942, a bolt of lightning struck the attic of Old Main. And it's a little hard to see in here, but there's some smoke coming up in here. And within a matter of hours, the building had burned. Because biology was in the basement, volunteers assisted faculty and students in removing valuable biological equipment from the basement, and where they went was Larson Hall. So Larson Hall was designated a temporary classroom for many, many of the courses that had been taught in Maine. The large center room where right now the health service is located, that was divided east to west by a partition. The south end was the biology lab, the north end was divided into 2 classrooms that basically housed other classes in the college. It was also wartime, and Luther went into an accelerated program lengthening summer school to 12 weeks, and now students could get a Luther degree by going to summer school for 2 summers and going to classes on campus for 3 years, or you could go for 2.5 years and 3 summers and still earn your degree from Luther. The number of biology majors decreased from that 16 in 1939 down to 1 to 3 per year up until 1949. It was a difficult time. But meanwhile, the Linnaeus Society was going strong. Look at that.
In November 1940, we had our first banquet of the season at the Hotel Winneshiek. The talk, medical research as a career and hobby, was good, but what I really enjoyed was the Chinese menu arranged as a novelty, featuring chicken chow mein and the lantern-adorned banquet room.
After a brisk hike in November 1942, we gathered in the biology lab in Larson for a hot supper furnished by the boarding club and sang such songs as
Teacher, teacher, I've been thinking what an ogre you must be when you put a simple freshman through this torrid 3rd degree.
and also
Oh chromosome, how faithful is thy mission. Thou givest to life variety, not brought by simple fission. From a remote antiquity, thou bringest my heredity. Oh chromosome, how faithful is thy mission.
We also viewed amusing lantern slides of sketches on natural history drawn by Professor Haslett.
In January 1944, 55 members of the Linnaeus Society enjoyed a New Year's supper party. Mr. Bones, the biology department skeleton, was a guest of honor, dressed in a pair of coveralls and a slouch hat.
In 1945, we had a picnic supper in the C.K. Price Gymnasium. A speaker had several trained otters on stage to illustrate techniques in otter training.
In April 1947, 25 members of the Linnaeus Society removed a large portion of the college dump from the bluff. We burned what we could and made neat piles of the remainder to be hauled away.
By the late 1940s, the north-south divider was removed in Larson Hall, and 2 more laboratories were added. Oh, excuse me, I have too much going on my screen here. This is a picture of the North Lab in Larson Hall. That's Sherm Haslett standing here. And as you can see in this particular lab, they had limited storage space in these cabinets. They had quite a few illustrative pictures or diagrams on the wall. Skeleton is back here. Perhaps 2, I'm not sure. That's definitely Mr. Bones. And as you can see, a lot of microscope work was going on. This area back here with the white curtain, behind that, there were shelves upon which were stored rats in rat cages. They did have some aquatic animals. They had turtles and they had frogs, but those were kept in a wire cage submersed in the river out there for safekeeping until they were needed. Another faculty member was added in addition to a student assistant, and in the 1940s, 2 faculty members and a teaching assistant often shared one 9 by 6 foot office. Botany was reintroduced when Gene Gellner came in 1946, and you can see the bluff across the river. He's leading a field trip. There were Saturday classes, regular Saturday classes until noon at that time. And in courses such as field biology, the catalog advises that students that laboratory work will consist almost wholly of field observations and surveys. It is advisable to leave Saturday afternoons open for this purpose. By 1957, there were 4 members. I wanted to make sure I didn't have my pages out of order. There were 4 members of the biology department. There was Sherm Haslett, who we already introduced. There was Frederick Geary, who taught physiology. There was Louise Ambule. She was the first female biology professor at Luther, and she was a botanist. And there was also a teaching assistant, and this was Bud Barth. His name is Vernon. I knew him when I was a student as Bud Barth. He's in one of the smaller labs that came when the divider disappeared. This would have been taught when used for upper level biology courses. As you can see, they're examining some skulls. We still have those in the Field Museum. We've got a few of these skeletons up here of animals in the anatomy lab. We, thank goodness, have gotten rid of all those chemicals probably used for physiology experiments. They would be a little old by this time. All of these individuals were Luther alumni, and they were still all crammed in the so-called temporary quarters of Larson Hall, which had so far been used for 15 years. But there were plans being made to build a brand new science hall. By May of 1959, plans neared completion. This, of course, is the east wing of the hall. On the main floor that we see right here was physics. Above them was chemistry. We've got the concourse. We've got the, I'm sorry, but this is not working quite right. We've got the biology wing on the first floor of the west wing, and we have above that math. And of course, there was a greenhouse addition and also the lecture hall. So let's take a look, because current students don't know what the concourse looked like. So here's the concourse with ramps leading from the second floor down to the first floor. And by the way, these are beanies for you current students. We used to wear beanies as freshmen, and those beanies were worn until at least homecoming, at which time they put up a greased pole, a 30-foot greased pole with a beanie nailed on the top. And the whole idea was that students needed to, in the freshman class, needed to climb up that thing and get the beanie off if they wanted to not have to wear the beanie for many more weeks. In the hall, of course, was also this lecture hall. This is where you're sitting today, but this is how it looked back in the early 1960s. The total cost of the new science hall was estimated at $1,322,000 with additional contracts for equipment. And although biology faculty had a lot of say in planning the biology wing of Walters, the space was provided, but the money had run out and equipment was in very short supply. For example, faculty did get a research lab next to the biology offices, but there was one lab bench and one hood, and that was it that was in the research lab. There was an elevator shaft, but there was no elevator. And for years, carboys of distilled water were hauled down from chemistry on those ramps that you saw by ancient cart. We don't have the nice carts that we have today, but we got those carboys down to biology, and that's how basically things were transported between the first and second floor. The department did have chymographs, and again, for the current students, I put this on, and for some of you who would like to remember chymographs, or maybe not. This is a drum with sooted paper on it. The drum goes around. This is a turtle. They've hooked this turtle heart up with basically some string to this lever contraption that comes out here. The lever has a paper stylus on the end, and every time the frog heart beats as that drum slowly revolves, you get an etching on the soot. Now, you have to basically fix this, so you had to figure out a way to run this through a shellac trough without rubbing off all of your tracings, and then once this was shellacked, you would hang it up to dry. This was the way we did physiology in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. They were around for a long time. While Walters was being built, an internal controversy arose in the late 1950s. Sometimes this is referred to as the disagreement over whether or not to teach evolution on campus, but evolution actually played a very small part in this debate, which totally changed the existing religion and biology departments. This is Wilhelm Ylvisaker. He was president at the time. He was well-intentioned, but he was mostly interested in the college's relationships with the church. He was felt by many to be vacillating and not acting decisively in leading the college in growth. He also did not stand up for his faculty, especially in matters of faculty salaries, which were abysmally low at that time. He depended a lot on the dean. He did not solicit others' opinions, and he also had Parkinson's disease, which undoubtedly did not assist in him being an effective president. Orlando W. Pip-Qualley was the dean. He was competent, he was effective, but he often charged ahead without consulting anybody. Qualley kept up with all of the Luther grads and grads of other liberal arts colleges, and when a position needed to be filled, he would contact them. He did not necessarily tell the members of the biology or other departments who he was contacting, or anything like that. He simply went out and got faculty members that needed to be procured for the faculty. Gerhard Belbum, head of the Bible department. It was called the Bible department back then. Very strong personality. Outspoken critic of the administration. He had extraordinary influence on students in his classes, but he also thought that college students' minds were still developing, and it was very important to nurture the faith of the student, a faith based in tradition. And he advocated biblical study that would not undermine or create doubts. Robert W. Jensen. He was a student of Belbum's when he was at Luther. When he pursued his PhD, he was in Germany studying under Karl Barth, a renowned 20th century theologian. Jensen was the polar opposite of Belbum. He believed that any attempt to protect students by censoring ideas or literary works would defeat the purpose of a Christian education. He was equally charismatic in front of classes, and I remember because I had him in this room in 1965-66 when he was teaching basically the Bible classes or the religion classes that we had in the core curriculum at that time on Saturday morning. That's when we were here. When Jensen up here came back to campus in the 1950s in order to teach, Belbum supported that. But the fact is that let me see where I am here. Let's go back. Let me not start that. Let's go on here. Because there are two other members of it that fit into all of this. One is going to be Sherman Hoslet. The important thing about Sherman Hoslet is that he is a very close friend of Belbum's, a very close friend of Belbum's. And he also had very strong dissatisfaction with the administration. He felt that the administration needed to support faculty much more, And when Jensen came back to teach on the faculty, one of the leading points was whether or not Jensen should actually be tenure track or not. And this is Frederick Geary. He was another member of the biology department at that time, and he also had a lot of dissatisfaction with the administration. So here we go. Here's what's happening. Belbum had made it very clear to the administration that he wanted Jensen not on a tenure track. Jensen could stay, but he did not care at all for how Jensen was basically asking students to think about all sorts of things that were not based in tradition. So what happened was Belbum decided that he would actually submit resignation. Things had gotten pretty bad by this time. Belbum was the head of the department, but he would hold department meetings without inviting Jensen and two others that he did not perceive would hold the majority opinions. It was that bad. And so he thought that if he submitted letters of resignation, and if the administration basically said, no, we want you to stay, things would be fine. And so he did that. He submitted his resignation papers on January 23rd, 1961, and Ylva Soccer said, okay. Now, Jensen was not totally immune to what was going on. He also submitted resignation papers. And the administration said, no, you cannot resign, we're keeping you. There was one other thing, because all of these people teaching in the biology department were pastors. They had all received basically training to become pastors. In Belbum's contract, he had also had it written that he came under pastoral call, meaning not only was he a teacher, but he was being called by the college. And so not only did the administration have to release him, but also the Board of Regents. And so he figured if he would supply a letter of resignation to the Board of Regents, and if they turned him down and said, no, you're staying, that would vindicate his position. It would show sort of how weak the administration was, and so that's what he did. February 21st, 1961, he submitted his resignation papers to the Board of Regents, and they said, okay. So that's Spring Belbum, and I believe 5 other religion members left. Jensen, with a couple others, stayed, but that particular department totally turned around. So how about these guys? How did they come into all of this? Well, Sherm Hazlitt, I guess the question sort of comes down to, did he believe in evolution or not? Because some of this was based on that, besides the administration conflict. It turns out that Sherm Hazlitt in the late 1950s actually had a seminar in his home, in the living room of his home. And if anybody knows, I know there's a picture of this, I couldn't find it. If anybody in here knows of that picture where I can find it, please let me know. There is a picture of all these students sitting around in Hazlitt's living room. They're all drinking coffee and having treats because Martha Hazlitt liked to entertain. And every week they met and they basically discussed a different chapter of Origin of the Species at Hazlitt's home in the late 1950s. And when students would ask Hazlitt, what did he think of this? Hazlitt would say, well, what do you think? But it was pretty clear to people who were in that class, including Dave Roseland, that indeed Hazlitt was very strong as far as evolution goes. Fred Geary also certainly believed in that, but they were also very good friends of Belbum, who had just left. So what to do? Faulders was opening up that next fall. They had been in Larson Hall for 17 years in the temporary quarters. So now the question is, should they all resign, or should they basically come into Faulders Hall of Science? And they elected to sign contracts and come back. So that fall, they came into Larson Hall. That particular, excuse me, thank you. I hope my students will do this for me. Thank you. They signed their contracts and planned to move into Faulders. At that time, Sherm Hazlitt was on leave, studying away. Fred Geary had some summer things. Bud Barr was rehired to come back now after having completed his master's degree. He spent the summer hauling a lot of equipment from Larson to Faulders. And basically, in the fall of '61, things were ready to take off. Classes started. But Hazlitt and Geary still had continuing dissatisfaction with the administration and felt increasingly isolated from the rest of the faculty. And then on a windy night, November 2nd, 1961, C.K. Price Gymnasium caught on fire.
The fire started backstage. The back windows were open and a west wind, gusting up to 40 miles an hour, blew flames through the building. I turned in an alarm, and the firemen arrived within moments, but they could not get water due to a lack of pressure and the fact that some of the valves were not open. I will never forget the carillon in the tower of the gymnasium with its chimes going crazy, and embers falling on the ground around Boulders and being blown far beyond.
Boulders was no longer just a science building. Overnight, Boulders became campus canteen, bookshop, and campus post office. This room, which was Boulders 117 at the time, became the site for chapel, Nordic choir, and Messiah rehearsals. Physical education courses and theater productions were done in the basement, and there were recitals in the concourse. And 3 weeks later, on November 22nd, 1961, both Sherm Hoslet and Fred Geary resigned. They were asked to reconsider, but the rift was too large. And Louise Anbulo, who was studying away that year at Washington University in St. Louis, elected not to return. And so it was time to start over again. Phil Reitan had been teaching. All of these pictures are as people were when they came. Okay? Phil Reitan had been teaching for 5 years at Wagner College on Staten Island when Pip Pauley called him and wanted to know if he would consider coming to Luther to head the biology department. Phil was a little concerned during his interview that there was only one member of the biology department there, Fred Geary, and the administration wanted to know Phil's views on evolution and whether or not his wife smoked. Pip Pauley was a little taken aback at how young Phil looked, although I thought Sherm Hoslet looked pretty young in 1940, and reconsidered his offer of the department chairmanship. But in the end, Phil was hired, in addition to Bud Barr, and we saw him talking to Sherm Hoslet in the lab a little bit earlier, John Choston, who had just gotten a master's degree, and Sarah McGaw. She graduated that spring, and she came back as a teaching assistant. And what just totally delighted me is that they are all 4 of them here right now. So I want them to stand up. So Phil reconstructed the biology department. Way too many courses were being taught for a faculty of this size. One thing he did was he combined many of the introductory courses into one general biology course that was team taught by the whole department, a change that has persisted for 50 years until today. In 1963, Russ Rulon came. Let's see if I can get this to work. Always in a white lab coat, with a stack of dittoed handouts, Russ could be heard coming by his whistle. No, 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 no. Let's try it again.
Click on the air.
There you go. Now you can wonder how I got that. I recorded that in 1999 when my office was next to Russ's, and I found that by threading a microphone over the ceiling tiles from my office into his, and then when I'd hear him coming, I would climb up on a chair and turn the microphone on, and then I'd climb down, run across the hallway to Robert Fitton's office and turn on the recorder. I could actually get Russ whistling on tape. And so that's why I was hoping that we could get this to actually come so you could hear. Do that again, shoot. Oh, no, it didn't do it. Okay, I gotta get the thing. Very good. I think I did. Okay. Now, in 1994, Roger Knudsen arrived to teach botany and ecology. When Knudsen arrived, the greenhouse contained 1 geranium and one grapefruit tree. With funding and tenacity, I remember he collected seeds and cuttings in every greenhouse we visited. And I say by we, every time we would go to Iowa Academy, he would visit the greenhouse and come out with his pockets loaded. He turned Luther's greenhouse into a lush environment with over 200 varieties of plants. In 1965, Dave Roslin came and became the field biologist and conservation biologist. Known for his love of the field, especially Cardinal Marsh, he and Knudsen had the tendency to wade in while talking to students, expecting everybody to follow. And most did, including a teacher in slingback white pumps and a short female student who could hardly keep her nose above water by the time they got to the middle of the marsh. In 1969, John Shostam returned with his PhD. This is President Farwell. This is John Shostam. This is John Shostam as St. Microbe. This is the microbial brunch that occurred annually around Christmas time. For years, John taught fermentation biology by having students make sauerkraut, cheese, yogurt, bread, and wine or soda pop, depending on the legal age at the time, as an integral part of the microbiology experience. Balder still lacked equipment.
I was a microbiology lab assistant. There was a very ancient and very dangerous autoclave for preparation of media. I'm still not sure how we kept media sterile with animals for physiology housed in cages under the benches used for microbiology prep. Dr. Shostam could make just about anything we needed. He took a storage cabinet designed to house the skeleton, and with shelving, a space heater and fan, army surplus transformer, and fish aquarium thermostat, he made an incubator that worked just fine.
Occasionally, there were difficulties getting biological specimens on time. One Sunday night, when the frogs for general biology had not arrived, the 4 biology professors at that time, Reitan, Lulan, Shostam, and Knudsen, went out to hunt frogs. Knudsen says it was like a replay of Steinbeck's Great Frog Hunt. They brought back 1 frog in pretty good shape. Fortunately, the shipment of frogs arrived the next day. In 1967, the biology department offered its first Florida jay drinker. Where's my Florida jay drinker first? Okay. Headed by Dave Rosen, who barely made it to campus due to an appendectomy in December, and his wife Joy, and Russ Rulon and his pregnant wife Joan.
37 students, tents, sleeping bags, duffels, cooking equipment, biology equipment, including microscopes, were all packed into a scenic Hawkeye bus. In fact, we had so much stuff that we were arrested and fined for being overweight on the way home. One of the more memorable experiences happened one night after an evening talk by a park ranger. I started to light a kerosene lantern to guide the way back to the campsite when kerosene that had spilled on the outside of the lantern ignited, turning the entire apparatus into one impressively flaming torch. What to do? I pitched it into the nearby canal, much to the horror of others in the audience and extreme displeasure of the park ranger.
This did not stop the biologists. The following year, 1968, found 2 faculty members and their wives, along with 32 students in rented cars, touring Oahu, Maui, and Hawaii.
I will never forget hiking into Haleakala, an extinct volcanic crater, in driving rain and very cold temperatures. We took turns keeping the wood stove going in the cabin throughout the night to dry our clothes.
The other memorable evening involved this island. When the professors went to a movie in Honolulu after dinner, we students procured some outriggers and paddled ourselves and beverages out to the islands in the dark.
I don't have a good, so we'll just watch this for a while. In 1970, Luther received a COSEP grant from NSF for $265,000. In today's terms of grants, that doesn't seem like a lot, but you have to realize this was 1970. In 1965, I started Luther, and for $1,775, I went to Luther for the entire year, including room and board. And so $265,000 is quite a bit. This particular program allowed hiring of new faculty. This is James Ekblad when he came. And he came basically as a freshwater biologist and also a statistician. Wendy Tessman, that's me back then. And I used to lecture with a boa constrictor. I had attention of the students. And just so for those of you who remember the boa constrictor, this is about the size that it got before it got a little too big to handle, and it went to the University of Wisconsin is where it went. More grant monies were secured in the 1970s for many years of student research. Student research testing well water.
My research team tested water from 200 farm wells with Dr. Chastam. We drank more cups of coffee in farmhouse kitchens.
My research group studied temperature regulation in skunk cabbage with Dr. Knudsen. We call it plants in heat.
My research group went to the Black Hills of South Dakota with Doc Roslian to do blood tests to determine calcium levels in bison blood compared to cows suffering from milk fever. What were we doing out there with those huge animals?
We were all thankful for the donated mobile home that served as our on-site laboratory.
I studied a 31-mile stretch of pool number 9 to determine the effect of the lock and dam system.
I studied the electrophysiology of fish and crayfish hearts in response to possible river pollutants.
I studied the effects of tow from barges suspending material in the water and nutrient limitation.
And this lovely picture would be an ice boat with a rear-mounted airplane propeller for winter research on the Mississippi. Now, this is a two-person operation. While the boat is moving, the friction of the boat rubbing on the ice produces just enough meltwater to hopelessly freeze the whole contraption solidly to the ice when you stop. Thus, two people, Dr. Ekblad, revving up the engine, and me with a crowbar trying to crack that sucker loose, and then, of course, trying to make a mad dash to fling myself on board before Dr. Ekblad and the boat were just a speck on the horizon.
Besides the faculty of equipment, Luther got their first biology technician, Jim Stevens. We needed somebody to maintain all this new equipment. Robert Fitton ably followed filling Jim's shoes. These are not Jim's shoes, but this is the best picture of early Robert that I have. And then we got a Baldur's secretary. Hooray! Jen Hemsat performed miracles, followed very capably by Lynn Williams. The 1980s saw more student research and expansion of the facilities. In 1981, the Salisbury Live Animal Center was added to Baldur's. It provided housing for rabbits, rats, birds, an aquatic room, and a wild animal room. The wild animal room was both a blessing and a curse, because no one on campus was really trained to rehabilitate hawks or other wild animals.
I helped Robert Fitton with an injured red-tailed hawk. We fed him rats and learned really fast about the strength and speed of his talons. I was just about to feed the hawk a rat when, before I had time to react, the hawk grabbed it with its talons. A sign above the cage now reads, "Keep all body parts 10 inches from the cage."
New faculty members in the 80s included Marianne Kaler. Who taught who taught genetics and molecular biology. Tex Sordo, teaching field biology, conservation, and ornithology. Tex never changes, by the way. And Kevin Krause. This is our dean now. Kevin taught cell biology and developmental biology. And then in the 1990s, Kirk Larson came to teach entomology and invertebrate zoology, and Mary Lewis, capably assisting in general biology, micro, and anatomy. So this was our department up through the 1990s. Highlights from the 1990s include an NSF grant to renovate the old greenhouse. So the old greenhouse that was beautiful inside, unfortunately, was very leaky. It was contributing significantly to global warming. And so we turned that into a research space, and we added a new greenhouse onto the facility. The establishment of Anderson Prairie and other outdoor lands were developed for classroom use, research use, and pure enjoyment. There was the addition of a scanning and electron microscope to the department. And there was the establishment of the Overholt Human Anatomy Lab, the beginning of human dissection at Luther.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into. No one in the class, not even Professor Stevens, had ever dissected a human cadaver before. But we worked together and we learned together, and wow, what an experience that was.
Although we're not quite up to the present, I'm simply going to go through the 1990s up until 2000 because that seemed an appropriate time to stop. I want to mention an event that occurred in 2000, the spring of 2000. I want to mention that because so many of you in this room were involved in this particular event. At Russ Rulon's 60th birthday, I got sort of a wild idea that we, and I mean all of you, all the biology majors that ever came through this place and nursing majors that Russ taught, could put together enough money to establish an endowed share for the department in honor of Russ. This is the department's sort of idea of what an endowed share should look like. So we've got things like a ginkgo leaf. We've got all sorts of things. This is actually a tape of Russ whistling, and you can sort of see some of the other things that are on here that are typical of biology. Many of you in this room are actually involved as contributors or callers or presenters or all of them. This was at the opening banquet. The people standing were some of the people that did calling for me. They called their classmates. I called. Took 2 years and many, many evenings of calling. But by April of 2000, we were there. We had over 900 contributors and $1.16 million. This is Russ that night. We kept it a secret from him. I'm not sure how, but we did. And he thought that he and Joan were coming to Peace Dining Room to pick up a bouquet to take to the president's house because he thought the president was hosting a dinner for him and the other retiring biologists. So here he is wondering what on earth I am doing dressed up and coming in basically to this dinner for him. For the rest of the weekend, we also had lots of presentations. These were students at registration and a plaque with the major donors. And many, many biology alumni returning for a very special weekend. So it's tradition for biologists to end special occasions with a benediction that was written by Phil Reitan. This is the biology mace. I've got it up in front. It's a requirement. As you can see, it's got a sacrum on the top. It's got some fossils. It's got some flattened fauna. It has all sorts of things on its side, typical of us. Up inside of its bowels are 7 departmental goals. That's important to put that. And so Phil usually reads this, but I'm going to do it today. So this is The Prayer of an Ancient Biologist by Phil Reitan. May your DNA properly replicate, and your operons always operate. May your feedback loops feed back, and may your cecum always remain a blind sac. May your friends like your coelom always be true. May you find a niche at a trophic level appropriate to you. May you outrun both predator and prey, and ever strive for that ancient goal to survive one more day. Coming. I hope you have a wonderful homecoming weekend. And if you've ever worked on a presentation such as this, you know that things don't always go quite as smoothly as you would like. And so I would like to leave you with one last picture, and this is of me about 3 days ago working on it.